Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Welcome to Smart Sustainability on March 13, 2022. No war is in essence a new war. History repeats itself until we actually break the cycle. We all carry parts of history in us that is waiting to be released. Since World War II, we haven't been so close to war as we are today. What's going on with Russia and the Ukraine is not only prompting us for a hopefully great awakening to what destiny we want to face going forward and shape as humanity, but also to coming to grips with healing the past and hopefully learning lessons. Putin's march into the Ukraine threw us back to a chapter in history that was up to now a taboo topic. We talk about the ethnic Germans, something few know about, what became also clear on the Rachel Maddow show last night. Why the tragic fate of ethnic Germans still plays a role today, and the lessons we can all learn from it, our topic tonight. Good evening, thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Hitler's annexation of the so-called Sudetenland was the trigger to World War II. It set events and a terrible dynamic in motion that turned into a gruesome reality to war with millions of people killed, murdered, and extinct. What's less known is also the gruesome beginning to peace in 1945. The story of the Sudeten isn't only about Hitler and Putin or the comparison of the two, and then also not only about who was when killed. It's a story of multicultural states, minorities' rights, equity, and inclusion. You see, topics that are at the very heart of what we actually grapple with today. So let me take you on a journey through history this evening, and you'll pick up the pieces. First, there was a massacre of the Nazis, then 3 million ethnic Germans expelled and partially extinct and their culture erased after World War II. A forgotten genocide of people who were German ethnicities but were living in Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, outside of Germany. You can see on the map where they are. Then a lot of arguing between countries up to now as a result of that. Guilt, silence about a topic that was long taboo. The rich 800-year history ended in a tragedy of blood and suffering and echoes to this very day at the center of European politics, at the center of understanding critical pieces to building the peaceful world we want to live in tomorrow. Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland in the appeasement of Munich in 1938 was the trigger to World War II. Sudetenland is a story of multiculture, the richness of centuries, nationalism, cycles, integration, change, and transformation. So what was it actually all about? And who are the Sudeten? Let's start with a few terms. The Sudeten Germans. Sudeten is a mountain range in the middle of Europe, today located in the Czech Republic at the border with Germany, Austria, and Poland. An area so vast of unspoiled nature in the midst of a grandiose mystical forest full of legends, fairy tales, craftsmanship, and culture. The term Sudeten, though, doesn't refer to ethnic Germans who lived in those mountains, but it also includes all people of German origin living throughout Bohemia and Moravia. Bohemia and Moravia are the areas you saw on the map, so look them up. I think it's important to understand their location. At the beginning of the 20th century, people with German origin lived predominantly in Bohemia and Moravia. Ethnic Germans had their own culture, their traditions, their language, even their own wind. There's a term which we use today called the Bohemia, which describes a particular quality of the wind in those areas. The term Sudeten wasn't until the 20th century. It's actually a political term. Before, the ethnic Germans living in Bohemia and Moravia were called German Bohemians and German Moravians. Quite simple. So let's look at the beginning of this very rich history at the center of Europe. The beginning, which really was kind of the beginning of the real Europe in the sense of multi-people, multi-cultures. The Slavic tribes that lived in Central Europe became a part of history when Charlemagne became the reigning sovereign over the Bohemian tribes, shortly after 800 AD. In 1158, Bohemia became a kingdom. Beginning with the 13th century, the kings of Bohemia came traditionally from the House of Luxembourg. Since 1526, the Bohemian kings came from the dynasty of the House Habsburg. The sovereigns of the Bohemian lands recognized early on, back in the 12th century, that much of the Slavic lands were too big and underused economically. Farming, trade, and businesses weren't developed, so they began to call in German settlers into their lands. Since the 12th century, German settlers put down roots and found in Bohemia practically a new homeland. Farmers, traders, craftsmen, builders came to settle, trusting the promises made by the kings for a new homeland, for work, bread, and earnings. Because the middle part of Bohemia was already occupied by the Slavic people, the German settlers dispersed around the mountain area, the Sudeten Mountains. They founded villages, built homes, and put in tremendous efforts over the centuries to turn the wild, vast forests into fertile farmland. Trade and mining were also developed very quickly as well. Around 1300, the Bohemian lands had already changed and began blossoming in abundance and prosperity. By 1500, most of the Bohemian cities were of German origin. They were administered as independent cities using German city administration basics. The pioneering spirit of the settler made basically the nobility of the Bohemian lands the wealthiest in the entire Holy Roman Empire of German nation. The nobility, the landowners, give the German settlers therefore the same rights as they had originally in their native homelands before they came to Bohemia. The German language had been present since the 9th century. Since about 1350, Prague, today the capital of the Czech Republic, was one of the most important cities in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. It was the residence of Karl IV, who was crowned the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The coronation was in Rome in 1356. Bohemia was one of the strongest and economically most important areas of the entire empire, a pearl of economic settling success, you would say today. In 1348, Prague founded the first university of Central Europe. It was a multicultural environment consisting of Jews, Czechs, Germans, and other ethnicities that lived together, a mini Europe, so to speak. A time when people sorted out who has something to say, when and where, who belonged to whom, and where was the best place for everyone. At the time, back then, people didn't sort themselves by language or ethnicity, but by ownership, religion, or class. Because of the tremendous success of the ethnic Germans in the settlements, the Slavic people started to develop jealousy. The real exploiters, though, was a different group. They were the Bohemian nobility. The ethnic German farmers, like the Czech people, had to serve the Bohemian nobility and pay 1/10 of their earnings. So with all the tensions going on, the first civil war between ethnic Germans and Czechs began back in 1419 and lasted for 17 years. Germans were the main sufferers. They were decimized. 1,500 villages had disappeared, cities were destroyed, and Bohemia was back in shambles. From that moment on, for 200 years, the Germans were deprived of their rights, their language was forbidden, and you can see there was a tense relationship developing early on. This tense relationship culminated in the defenestration of Prague, which was the birthing of the 30 Years' War, which was also ignited, you guessed it, in Bohemia. We don't have enough time to go into all the details of this very rich history, so I want to fast forward At the end of the 30-Year War, 1648, Bohemian nobility was abolished and Bohemia, Moravia became part of the Habsburg Empire. Now, with Bohemia belonging to the Habsburg Empire, the Czech population reached its lowest point, politically, culturally, and language-wise. The nationalistic movement, which actually began in France in the 19th century, also reached Bohemia and further affected the relationship between the Czechs and the ethnic Germans. You had people who believed in nationalism and ethnicity. In the 19th century, all these thoughts were already coming through. They demanded that each ethnic group has a right to self-determination. As a consequence, the Habsburg Emperor in Austria gave the Czechs their rights for their own schools, their own language. But the Czechs wanted more. It wasn't enough. Thinking that all groups of a particular ethnic origin belonged together and should live among themselves, they demanded their own state. And that's when the trouble began. Because throughout Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, people of various ethnic groups were pretty dispersed. It was the basis of their existence, what you could see at the beginning of the map. The same was true for the Sudeten. They were dispersed all around the mountain range, covering Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. So remember, today on the map, it's the area of Germany, Czech, Austria, and Poland. So the idea of an independent state, according to ethnicity where people lived, wasn't really possible or feasible. So with an increasing nationalistic movement, people of different ethnicities who used to live and work successfully together for centuries began increasingly living segregated lives. Who used to identify as Bohemian was now split into either Czech or German. Quite a stretch, isn't it? Remember not to be confused with the German Germans who lived in the German Reich. So this dividing identities into German and Czech from what used to be embraced as integrated Bohemian ethnicity plays a significant role during the founding of the Czech state later and the tragedy that followed. Since 1900, the various ethnic groups started closely watching each other, making sure, well, first of all, distrusting, and then making sure none of them got more rights than the other. It led to many arguments, and a way to summarize this is that practically every dual-lingual city sign caused already a major conflict. This is when society began to change, really change. Segregated schools were built, churches, even political parties. You had, for example, in Bohemia, two social democratic political parties, a German social democratic party and a Czech social democratic party. None of this makes any sense if you think about it, because despite the fact that the democratic parties actually said they represented inclusion and solidarity for the unity of the working class, well, you're getting the drift. You still had two parties, essentially, representing the same thing, however separate in different countries. So, up to 1918, Bohemia was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Czech leaders, though, had pursued the dream of an independent Slavic state already a while ago. To further that goal, they spread untruths about actual size of the ethnic German population. As an example, they would say, oh, there's only 2 million Sudeten Germans that lived in Bohemia, when in reality it was an entire million more, 3 million. They denied the entire existence of the German settlement areas that had occurred for the past 800 years, and with that, their history. When the first Czech state had been founded in 1918, they inherited the richest areas of all of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. There were fertile farms, brimming industry, a flourishing infrastructure, and most of them were built by the ethnic Germans dispersed around. Czechoslovakia was part of the peace negotiation, despite the fact that they actually hadn't existed as an official state at that point of time yet. Edvard Beneš, a Czech political figure, asserted himself with the support of France after years of doing a negative campaign against ethnic Germans that the first Czechoslovakian Republic was proclaimed in October 1918 in Philadelphia. Yes, you heard right, in Philadelphia. in absence of an actual peace treaty. Now, the biggest ethnic group in this newly formed state were the Czechs, but there was still a population of 23.5% who were ethnic Germans. The German Bohemian Landesversammlung, the group representing Sudeten Germans, asked that the Sudetenland inhabited by the ethnic Germans should become part of Austria in the new forming order of Europe after World War I. Well, why? Because it shared the language and cultural roots. They were denied by the Allies, and the Czech government in Prague perceived this whole request of the Sudeten as treason. As a result, the Sudetenland, of course, when you look back, why would this do though? Because the Sudetenland was the most productive and resource-rich area of Czechoslovakia, with industries such as glass, porcelain, textile. Of course, they weren't going to give it up. Doesn't make sense, does it? But as a result, Czech legions occupied the Sudetenland with brutal force. In 1919, during negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles, the Czech government assured the Allies that the Sudeten Germans would receive the very same rights as the Czechs and the Slavs. The German language would be the second language of Czechoslovakia, and no oppression would happen. Reality is, none of it was true. The Allies later admitted that they had been deceived by the Czech leaders. There's actually a documentation on that you can see in documentary movies. We didn't have the rights to it, so I couldn't include it. The Czech government treated the Czech population much better than the German population. Rights that the Germans used to have were abolished. German schools were closed. In land reforms, their land was seized by the government and redistributed to the Czechs. Czech administrators were replacing German-speaking administrations in the German settlements. Government contracts were given to Czechs, not to Sudeten. The German Bohemians had become less than a tolerated minority, though they constituted 3 million inhabitants. Now, naturally, that had to lead to one disaster sooner or later. Along comes Wall Street, 1929. So because of its economic infrastructure and industrial focus, the crash of Wall Street hit the Sudetenland especially hard. Due to the oppression and being treated as a minority by the Czech government in Prague, frustration among the Sudeten grew, and voices became much louder that they would be better off, perhaps, if they could become part of the neighboring Germany. Henlein, the leader of the Sudeten National Party at the time, demanded autonomy of the Sudetenland. In political elections, in fact, his party had more votes than the strongest Czech party. Nevertheless, Edvard Beneš, then Czech president, showed no consideration. Henlein brought the frustration of the Sudeten Germans to Hitler's attention, who had come to power in 1933. Needless to say, the situation grew really tense. 1938, Beneš mobilized 1.5 million Czech soldiers and proclaimed a Standrecht. It's kind of an emergency act over the Sudetenland. The soldiers confiscated all of the Sudeten radios, held 20,000 Sudeten hostage, destroyed tunnels, bridges, and train tracks. That was the pretext for Hitler to demand that Sudetenland be annexed by Germany. Now remember, World War I had just been over in 1918. Everyone in Europe was terrified of a new war. We're talking 20 years apart. So in the Munich appeasement of 1938, France, Great Britain, Italy agreed that Germany could annex the Sudetenland. The Czech government, though, was not part of the negotiations, neither were the people, but it accepted the annexation. The ethnic German minorities in Czechoslovakia then served kind of as a doormat for Hitler, beginning at October 1938, when he marched into the Sudetenland. The Sudeten didn't know much about Hitler's NSDAP goals or orientation of the party. For many of them, the annexation was a door to freedom, their rights being restored. Just in 1938, after Hitler had marched into the Sudetenland, the Gestapo had deported 2,500 Sudeten Germans to the concentration camp in Dachau. All in all, the Nazis deported 20,000 Sudeten Germans, 30,000 fled to other countries, and 300,000 Jews in Bohemia died. Hitler, however, had other goals, of course, as we all know. He moved on, marching into Prague, 1939. The Czechs suffered under the occupation of the German Wehrmacht, no question. Himmler stated the goal of the Nazis in Bohemia and Moravia really was war would be senseless if it didn't result in a full German settlement in Bohemia and Moravia based on race and the purity of blood. The Nazis committed atrocious acts in Czechoslovakia. When the German Wehrmacht withdrew in 1945, the brutality was reversed. Now the Sudeten, first used by the Nazis, now were the first point of anger for the Czechs and the advancing Red Army. More than 2 million German women were raped by the Red Army, including girls as young as 5 years old. The Czechs directed all their anger from the Nazis, but also the century-long conflict with German settlers who had been there for 800 years and built the most prosperous area of the Czech lands. The Czech militia took brutal revenge on the ethnic Germans, the Sudeten. Never mind that many Sudeten were fighting in the Czech army during the war. Never mind that some had Jewish roots. Edvard Beneš has held an important role in Czech politics since 1918, became president of the newly found Czechoslovakia, where he declared at the end of October 1945, "Today, it's clear that the majority of Germans since 1934 was in full agreement of Hitler's doing and has worked towards the full destruction of our country and thus is to be held fully responsible for what the Nazis did." Let that sink in for a moment. It was a carte blanche for brutality, massacre, and another injustice. He pointed out that a joint life in Czechoslovakia that had been the backbone of the country for almost a millennia was impossible, and that it was time to find a, quote, final solution to the long-held German problem in our lands, and cleanse Czechoslovakia once and for all from German hands. The end of Czechoslovakia with German settlers would be written in blood. What happened was actually worse. During peace talks, Churchill once said, "Enjoy the war because peace will be savage." Yep, it was. The Sudeten Germans that lived in their homelands for 800 years were supposed to be transferred in an orderly way to what became the newly created Republic of Germany. 3 million Sudeten Germans were about to be disowned, plundered, expelled, brutally mistreated, all their lands, property, and belongings confiscated without compensation to this very day. Punishment excursions took place where Sudeten were brutally murdered. And you do see a video in there. I would advise, viewer discretion is advised. This is not suitable material for children. What was supposed to be an orderly transfer turned out to be a wild expulsion with a brutality that rivaled what just occurred in the war by the Nazis. Czech militias knocked on people's doors and dragged them out in the streets. Families were pulled out of the house. Children dragged out of schools. Systematic expulsions took place. Ethnic Germans had to wear white bands with an N on their arms, similar to the yellow Star of David that the Jewish people had to wear during Nazi time. N standing for Nemitz, the Czech word for German. There were curfews in place. Germans were not allowed to use public sidewalks or streets, and they could only go shop at certain hours. They were put into forced labor camps. Many were moved to concentration camps such as Theresienstadt. Some concentration camps, in fact, were kept open till 1950 for those who weren't allowed to leave during the expulsion. There are many stories that came out in recent years about the brutal mistreatment of the Sudeten. Villages that were wiped out and killed, babies beaten to death, men randomly shot, people brutally beaten, tortured, and simply thrown on the street, run over by trucks. All of Bohemia was turned into a giant concentration camp. The Sudetens were no more citizens. Their citizenship had been revoked. Remember, at this point, they belonged nowhere and to no one. They had no right to exist. Women had a duty to work and serve. All women. Schools and churches were closed, and even the clerics were put into forced labor. Those who were expelled had to march 40 miles and more to get to neighboring Austria and Germany, and many didn't survive the march. The numbers of how many Sudeten Germans were killed during what is considered the largest ethnic expulsion in history varies greatly. The German government puts the number at 240,000, but including the expulsion also from the eastern areas, from Prussia and the former Eastern German areas, that number can go as high as 2 million. Before the actual expulsion took place, the Sudeten Germans were supposed, apparently, to go through an ocean of blood and tears. Their culture, 800-year history, wiped out. A forgotten genocide that plays a role in history to this very day. Now here's why. Beneš had issued the so-called Beneš decrees in 1948. He did so retroactively, which provided the legal grounds for the wild expulsion of Sudeten, in which he declared that any crime against a German wasn't a crime. It was legal and just for the fight of freedom as retribution for the crimes committed by the Nazis. Mind you, at this point, we're talking 1948. The war ended in 1945. The Sudeten were punished for a crime they themselves had little to do with, and the Allies had watched, once again, how crimes against humanity were committed with no one saying a word. Till today. It's 2022. So what happened to the ethnic Germans when they actually made it, to those who made it to Germany? Well, many were treated by Germans as second-class citizens when they arrived. With Germany being in rubble, cities completely bombed, and the country struggling with the rebuilding, Germans had their hands full with their own country. They didn't want to share, and certainly not with people who had nothing but the clothes on their back. They spoke differently, had different traditions, different cultures. Many Sudeten Germans came from highly cultured areas such as Karlovy, the Golden City, as my family did. They had an industrial background, were successful business people in Bohemia, a country with a century-rich tradition of multicultural, craftsmanship and cultural vibrancy. Bohemia was far advanced through the centuries in a cultural exchange and political decision-making and multicultural interaction, with Central Europe's first university, spa towns that dated back to Charlemagne. They had a more export-oriented international outlook to life. Let me name a few Sudeten for you so you actually have an idea. Oskar Schindler was a Sudeten. Ferdinand Porsche was a Sudeten. Yes, the founder of Porsche cars. Many of those people that were expelled rebuilt factories and industry. But it took some time. About 1 million Sudeten Germans were transferred to West Germany, Bavaria. Since the German cities had no capacities, most of them were sent to the rural areas because rural areas had less suffered from war damage and were thought to be better suited. Now, Sudetens were housed in resettlement camps, such as in Wiesau, a small town a few miles from the Czech border, where about 7,000 resettlers arrived in trains per day. Now, small community with 7,000 settlers. The Sudeten lived in these camps several years before they could find a way to stand on their own. My grandparents told me that the people in Wiesau looked down on them as foreigners, and those who managed to bring some things out, like jewelry, were ripped of the belongings, the locals being charged high prices for meat and groceries. We, for example, I know that from my grandfather, paid for meat and groceries with rings that, as my grandmother said, they got out by putting that in sausages when they were kicked out of their house. Conditions in these camps were kind of subhuman. So with the post-war economic boom, though, many could rebuild their lives. In our case, by 1952, My grandfather had rebuilt a porcelain factory in that small town of Wiesau. We changed trademarks, that's it, from JKW Karlsbad to JKW West Germany, built housing for other settlers who wanted to learn the craft, trained them, and decades later, some of them started their own businesses. I sometimes believe my family stayed so close to the Czech border because they hoped to be able to go home one day. The local communities, though, in Western Germany, envious with what the Sudeten Germans that came with nothing and yet managed to rebuild, were plagued by jealousy, a kind of repetition of what happened before it took place. And in the rural areas sporting what became the Iron Curtain post-war, people, they had a pretty closed mind developed and an extremely strong tribal culture and belonging, not really integrating the Bohemians for a few generations. I asked my grandmother one day as to why she wouldn't visit the Czech area, which during communism we could, you just had to ask for permission, right? She replied she would go one day to Prague and Riga and Karlsbad when the borders are back open. When my grandmother died in 1986, the Iron Curtain fell in 1989. The Beneš decrees from 1945 remain a problem today. There's a part of unresolved history still influencing Europe. Now, why is that the case? Well, the Sudeten Germans' journey wasn't over when they came to Germany after the war. There were many traumas and personal issues to deal with. First of all, practical things. You had to rebuild your lives with nothing, from nothing, and in a hostile environment. You were uprooted and dealt with loss and grief. You faced a completely different culture. Bohemia, as a thriving, multicultural, open culture for centuries, the rural German areas, by contrast, were narrow-minded people, many of them extremely poor. Germany, loaded with guilt, didn't want to talk about loss and expulsion. In fact, no one there wanted to. Anything that had to do with the war was silenced in societies as well as in families. The whole focus was on rebuilding. The thinking was, we survived, we lived, let's go through. Germans didn't really start talking about the war and the Holocaust until the following generations. Our generation actually started to ask questions and began to work through history. East Germany, after the war under Soviet occupation, didn't want to have any talks about expulsion as they were kind of busy and trying to keep Germans from moving further west. And then Czechoslovakia, well, that was now a socialist brother state. And among those, you don't point out each other's crimes. And in Western Germany, new organizations were cropping up that represented the interest of the expelled Sudeten. Of course, at the very heart of these things were the claims for return of property, return of lands, and reparations. Within Germany, in the political scene, that posed a problem post-World War. Because Bavaria, the largest state in Germany, who took in 1 million Sudeten, stood with the Sudeten Germans in their demands for return of land. But the Chancellor of Germany at the time, Willy Brandt, pursued a policy of making peace with the East, in which the Sudeten question marked a huge disruption that no one could have or afford. It had no place. The conflicts last from 1945 till now. The relationship between Czechoslovakia and Germany started to relax a little bit after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989. Then President of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, apologized for the suffering and the injustice done to the Sudeten Germans by Czech hands. However, in 2002, the then German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder canceled a trip to Prague due to the question of why the Beneš decrees were still active today. Yes, remember those decrees that said that committing a crime against a German wasn't really a crime? They're still active today, 2022. Because, as you can see, because they were still active, it was a problem for the Czech Republic to become a full member of the European Union. So despite the difficult past, people who lived at the borderlands on the Czech and on the German side started to re-engage. Conversations began. Visits of Czechs to Germany and Germans to the Czech Republic restarted. Commuter traffic began. Once again, the region became closer to what once could be described as a multicultural existence. By 2015, the Sudeten German Representative Association seized their claims for return of lands. So while people and politics have gotten closer, the actual heart of the conflict, though, is still being dodged. It's as central in Europe as is as central to the conflict today. So often, painful issues are bypassed and suppressed by saying, oh, let's just forget the past and focus on the future. Reality, though, is that the past lives on in all of us. It keeps repeating itself until it has been recognized, acknowledged, and integrated before anyone can really move on. America is learning this fact by how we integrate the African American history and the Native American history. There's so much to work through, recognize, and acknowledge. And now with all that's happening in Ukraine, we're being thrown right back in history. Different place, different actor, same playbook, and same lessons.